Welcome to The World This Week, a week that's left many asking whether another Arab Spring uprising is at a turning point. I have with me here in the studio today four Paris-based correspondents, eminent correspondents. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, columnist with the Sunday Telegraph, one of, I suppose, many titles.
And most of it, actually.
Vivian Walt, contributor here for Time Magazine, a US-based Time Magazine. Patrick Vignal, senior correspondent for the French service of Reuters here in Paris. And Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, columnist for the French weekly Le Nouvel Observateur. Welcome to all of you. Our top topic, Syria's dominated the headlines, and Syria's strongman president, Bashar Assad, has a loud and clear message for the world, and that is basically, I am still in charge here, and I'm still calling the shots, literally. Struck a meeting of his 14-person war council, killing several members of his inner circle. Assad moved to reassert his authority with a fierce barrage of rocket fire, backed by helicopter gunships, targeting pockets of resistance in the streets of Damascus. Now, Wednesday's bomb killed 3 men Assad had entrusted to try to crush the insurrection. Now, among the dead were Defense Minister Daoud Rajia and Assad's much-feared brother-in-law, Asef Shawkat. He was a former chief of military intelligence. And a fourth member of Assad's elite inner circle, the head of general security, has also reportedly died of wounds sustained in the bombing. Now, after a fierce backlash, the Syrian president's security forces appear, I say appear because we haven't confirmed, to have regained control of a key rebel stronghold this Friday in the Medan area. It's on the southwestern outskirts of Damascus. Now, on Thursday, yesterday, the number of dead from fighting across Syria was reported already to have risen above 300. That would be the worst one-day toll in this 17-month uprising. And this is tens of thousands of refugees, of course, continue streaming across Syria's borders into Jordan, into Turkey, into Lebanon. We're going to get to the diplomacy aspect in a little while. I want to start with all of you tonight with what's going on the ground here. We've been seeing the headlines, we've been seeing endgame, turning point. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, let me start with you. Is it premature? Did we all jump to this conclusion? Assad is sort of down and out? He seems to be bouncing back.
This is a man with an army, a secret police, and an aviation. He's not finished yet, but certainly the fact that you've got street fighting now in the streets of Damascus, which was not something that happened even a month ago, shows that it's moving into a much more decisive phase. We still do not know. It's very obvious that on their own, the various rebels, because it's not so coherent, would probably not have reached that, but they have been helped from abroad. Vivian will tell you more because she's been writing much more about this than I have on the influx from the same people who were during the insurgency in Iraq back into Syria. But what we also know is that places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia have been sending lots of weapons. They've been probably sending experts.
We still don't know for sure exactly concretely what they've been sending.
Well, they have been sending stuff, and they have been absolutely ignoring any kind of diplomatic effort to make them even account for what they're doing. So it doesn't look very good, and it's a war. It's completely a war. They can't say that it's a number of terrorist events.
And Vivian, a war in the streets of Damascus here. What is your sense? Damascus is a large, spread out city. We've seen those images of the presidential palace and all these outskirt areas. How close? How much control do you sense that these rebels have? Closer to the actual nerve centers of power?
Well, just listening to what residents are saying in Damascus, and what's interesting is that more and more residents are feeling freer to talk to foreign journalists, which they weren't just a few weeks ago. It does seem to vary very much from neighborhood to neighborhood, and things go in ebbs and flows, and there's sporadic fighting, and then it dies down. There's sporadic fighting again. Clearly, both sides are stretched fairly thin. And in a city the size of Damascus, it's sprawling, it's hilly, it's geographically difficult to control and cordon off. You might have this possibly for a very long time.
This could be one of these low-intensity, simmering wars. People have been
Well,
using
let's
Lebanon
not forget
as a...
Sarajevo, for example.
Sarajevo, which was perfectly sort of, shaped for that type of siege.
It went on for years. So, feasibly, we could have a city that's relatively at war, under siege, perhaps for quite a while.
With literally almost dividing lines in certain areas which are no-go areas and others where it's okay to go.
Beirut, as you say, yeah.
And Philippe Chevrolet, to bring you in here, we've been hearing all week that Assad still has these loyalist forces around him. Yes, they knocked out this brain trust, this war council, whatever you want to call it, but they are easily replaceable, I'd surmise.
The situation looks a little bit like the last days of Gaddafi in Libya. From the outside, we could think of that. And what is interesting is to look at the media coverage that the regime tries to do, the PR that the regime tries to do, and we can see a lot by looking at that. If we look at Assad's interviews on the speeches on the TV, we can see that he each time its location, the locations of the interviews are different, and we can see that it kind of disappears and reappears on TV, and the control of the media will tell a lot about the situation, the real situation on the ground. Who controls the media?
And it's very confusing because in the hours after the attack, the question going around was, where is Assad? People wanted to see him. He wasn't showing his face publicly. And then all of a sudden, he popped up at these state funerals. The state broadcast some images there. Patrick Vignal.
Yeah, but there's still a feeling that his days may be numbered. The next few days will be critical in showing whether he can recover from the bombings of his inner circle. But I think there was a very important sign today, even if it was denied. It was Russia's envoy to Paris saying that Assad had actually accepted that he had to leave. So that could be a turning point.
That was the Russian ambassador to France.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure he might have sort of partially retracted that statement later on.
Yeah, but it could be a sign that not only Assad's attitude is changing, but also that Russia's attitude is changing, and that they are now accepting that Assad will have to leave one day or another, and they have to discuss it.
We've seen a lot of that with Gaddafi too, a lot of rumors of that kind with Gaddafi too, so it's difficult to say if it's true or not.
But the whole equation on Libya, I don't think one can really make too much of an equivalence between Libya and Syria for the very reason that nothing would have budged Gaddafi had it not been for NATO. And you don't have NATO here. You don't have a united UN Security Council. And without that, it seems like this is a stalemate.
He can just hang on. He can hang on however long it takes.
I would imagine so, yeah.
So you would not sort of ascribe any credency to those who talk and say he's probably negotiating some way to get out right now, perhaps with the Russians themselves. We've heard rumors to that effect this week.
I would imagine that at some point the Russians are going to be somewhat embarrassed internationally by him hanging around too long. What the Russians don't want is to have the West dictate the terms to them. And it's so clear, it seems, that Putin has sort of thought that, under Medvedev, who was president when the whole Libya debate was going on, he kind of caved into Obama. He seemed to be enthralled with Obama. Here comes Putin, totally different guy.
Total reversal.
He's not going to do it again.
Governing style. I mean, let's look at this diplomatic angle for a second. The U.S. Security Council remaining seriously deadlocked, failing for a third time in nearly a year to pass a resolution seeking to punish Syria for not putting that ceasefire into effect. And sort of the Western sponsors of the resolution was really originally Britain. They were scathing in their condemnation after the vote this week in the Security Council, in which for the third time Russia, China said niet. And they suggested, the sponsors, that history would prove Russia wrong, that it's already proving it wrong. Let's listen first to what Susan Rice had to say.
It's pitiful and deeply regrettable that again today, Russia and China, for the third time, have vetoed a resolution that garnered the overwhelming support of this Security Council.
3,000 deaths, a veto. 6,000 deaths, a veto. 17,000 deaths, a veto. And we've done everything to unite the international community to reach a political transition and to support Kofi Annan.
Now, the Russians, I don't have to tell all of you, have been sticking to their solid line all along, right, Anne Elizabeth Boutet,
Yes,
which has
but
been...
they have a perfect reason for that. I mean, at the end of the day, this is the UN. UN are unable to act. This is not news. This is what happens all the time. So you can have a great deal of rhetoric, but at the end of the day, the UN is completely inefficient in that kind of conflict. And it was in 20 years ago in Yugoslavia, and it is now in Syria. And I am not surprised. The Russians actually have real interest in Syria. They have a military navy base. We're talking about hard things on the ground here. There's the great thing about the Russians, which is actually true, that they want warm sea ports, and that's very important for them. So they have, if any peace is concluded in the area on the question of Syria, if any solution is brought to the Syria problem, it is going to be with the Russians firmly in the driving seat, or at least that's what they want. And Libya was very different in that respect. They didn't have the same kind of interest. They also knew that the terrain in Libya is very different than the compact terrain in Syria. I think this was quite predictable, and the Russians certainly do not want an Islamist victory. So whatever they can hammer out and whatever can work, because it doesn't mean because they have an iron will that they have an iron efficiency, so to speak. But it's very obvious that they want to be, if anything changes and it looks like it's moving towards some sort of resolution, they want to be in the driving seat for that.
Patrick Vignal.
Yeah, but would Russia accept Chapter 7 resolution? It might not be a solution to the problem, because...
Threatening sanctions and then ultimately perhaps military
exactly,
intervention.
using all possible means, including military means.
Which was not in the vote yesterday. They
No.
were not under the article that would have allowed for military intervention, just sanctions.
Exactly, just sanctions. But then if you vote resolution under Chapter 7, it means that you can use every possible means to enforce sanctions, including military intervention. That would probably not work in Syria.
I just want to take a listen to what the UN Security Council rep, the Russian representative Vitaly Churkin, had to say. He basically, at one point, and Russia said this before, he accused the West and all the Western sponsors of fanning the flames of extremism, even terrorist groups, echoing the line of Bashar Assad when he says it's armed gangs and terrorist groups who are being fomented by outside foreign forces. Let's hear what Vitaly Churkin had to say.
The sponsors of this motion that has just been defeated have attempted to fan the flames of confrontation in the Security Council. The draft we have just voted on was biased. The threat of sanctions was levelled exclusively at the government of Syria. This runs counter to the spirit of the Geneva document and does not reflect the realities in the country today.
Sanctions exclusively the government of Syria. Well, what are you going to level sanctions on the opposition? I sort of lost that thought there. Anyone volunteer? Try to explain that for me.
I think it's he's staking his claim to then negotiate with Assad on this one, which is to say, look, we are your only chance of you're getting some sort of a deal, and we are defending you at the UN. I think when the Russians want not to mind the UN, they are perfectly happy not to. But in this instance, I think they are playing their own game in order to find a solution that will preserve their interests, and again, in which they actually, in some ways, are on our side, in that they are certainly opposed for all sorts of reasons, including internal Russian reasons, for a rise of Al-Qaeda in Syria.
Putin looking at dissent on his home front.
Yes,
wanting to have a free hand.
Of course. Putin very much with an eye on Chechnya. But in addition to that, I mean, just to roll back a few minutes ago when Susan Rice said, history will prove you wrong. Well, actually, we don't really know that yet. And I think that for a lot of Western diplomats, this is the problem, that nobody can actually know where this is all heading. And if we do have a total disintegration of Syria, that could be extremely dangerous, far beyond the parameters of just this one country.
Philippe Chevrolet, it could be a lot worse. Perhaps the Russians, as wrong as they may be, maybe they're not that wrong.
I wouldn't say that. The situation could get much worse if no political solution is found, obviously. And it's always the same PR fight. It's an internal battle versus it's a humanitarian condition. We should intervene in Syria and so forth. And the Russians have the same trouble in Chechnya. their own opposition, so to speak.
So, and this is what some
It's
people
always
suggested.
this
Putin
fight.
perhaps wants to have a free hand. He wants to be able. I'm not saying that he supports murder, but perhaps he looks. Is it possible he looks
never
at?
mind.
Well, or he looks at Assad and he says, he sees the West trying to dictate to Assad, and he says, I want to have a free hand at home as well. He can understand what he's doing.
Oh, this used to be the Kissinger doctrine. He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, and that certainly is the Russian doctrine now.
Very briefly, in the time we have left to talk about Syria a little bit, the refugee issue, I said in the beginning, we've had thousands of refugees streaming across the borders into Turkey, into Lebanon, into Jordan. We have seen images, perhaps we could show our viewers some of those images, of the rebels actually, fighters on the border, destroying some of the symbols of not just Assad himself. You could see it right there. That's obviously a big billboard of Assad, but also of his predecessor, his father in power, Hafez Assad, smashing, billboards, taking down. These images really remind you, we were talking about this, the toppling of the Gaddafi symbols, even the toppling of the Saddam Hussein, yeah. I mean, when you look at these pictures, does this suggest to you that even outside Damascus, much of Syria is already out of Assad's control?
Well, I must say it did remind me a lot of being on the border of Iraq, on the Jordanian border of Iraq, and seeing those posters of Saddam Hussein go down, and us all rolling in as journalists, and so that could happen imminently, I guess, once you lose control of your international borders. What actually makes you a cohesive nation? I'm not quite sure.
And you mentioned to me, I'm sorry, just before we go to a break, that you interviewed the Iraqi foreign minister
Yes,
today or
indeed.
yesterday, and he told you very, very briefly.
Well, the Iraqi foreign minister was in Paris expressing enormous concern about the filtering back and forth of al-Qaeda militants who've been very active for years in western Iraq and are now, he says, very active in Syria. Without those borders secured, one could imagine this conflict spreading back into Iraq.
Was it ever
I'm
secure?
sorry,
that border?
and we're
Sorry.
unfortunately going to have to leave it there because time is out in this first half. We could go on a long time about this conflict, no end in sight. We're going to have to leave it there. We're going to be coming back, obviously, in the second half. We're going to be looking at one of the world's most reclusive regimes, and we're going to be asking, what does Kim Jong-un have to do with Disney and the Magic Kingdom? Maybe an answer to that question when we come back after the news.